The first time I saw the bruises, I told myself they were nothing. That was the lie I lived on for weeks. My 6-year-old son, Oliver, came home every Thursday from my mother's house with some new mark on his body, and at first I did what exhausted single mothers are trained to do best. I explained it away: a tumble off the swing set, a rough game with another kid, the edge of a table. A child that age is always bumping into something, always skidding across the world with too much speed and not enough judgment. But then the bruises stopped looking accidental. They started showing up in places little boys don't usually injure in normal play. Under his shirt sleeve, along his ribs, across his back, where I had to lift his t-shirt to see them. Hidden, deliberate, careful, never on his face, never on his hands where anyone would notice right away. Whoever was doing it knew exactly how to keep the damage invisible long enough to keep getting away with it. And the worst part was Oliver's face. He stopped meeting my eyes. A few months earlier, he'd come barreling through the apartment door every afternoon with scraped knees, wild stories, and a laugh so loud it made the neighbors complain. After the bruises started, he came in quietly, too quietly. He'd take off his shoes, set his backpack down by the wall, and wait for me to ask the right question. Sometimes he'd answer me with a shrug and a muttered, "I don't know." Sometimes he'd just stare at the floor until the silence became unbearable. One Thursday, I found 4 finger-shaped bruises wrapped around his upper arm, one thumb mark pressed into the soft inside like someone had squeezed him hard enough to leave a print. My stomach dropped so fast, I had to brace myself against the counter. "Oliver," I said, kneeling in front of him so I could look at him eye to eye. "Who grabbed you like that?" He went still. That stillness scared me more than any tears would have. He swallowed, then whispered, "Grandma says I bruise easy." "Easy?" He nodded, and then his little face changed. Panic bloomed all at once, as if he'd said too much. "Don't tell her I told you," he blurted out, voice shaking. "Please, Mommy," she said, "if I tell, you'll lose your job and we'll have to live in a box." I felt my whole body go cold. I touched his cheek with the back of my fingers. "Who told you that?" "Grandma." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mother had watched Oliver every Thursday for 2 years. That arrangement had saved me. My husband had left when Oliver was barely 4, and I had been doing the math of survival ever since. Rent, groceries, electricity, school fees, gas, medicine, every dollar stretched too thin. My mother had stepped in with a kind of confidence that made refusal feel impossible. Grandmothers are supposed to raise grandchildren, she told me when I first hesitated. It's what family does. She never asked me for money, never complained, always had Oliver fed when I picked him up, his hair brushed, his face washed, his shoes lined neatly by the door. She made the whole thing look clean and simple, almost noble, like she was rescuing me. For 2 years, I believed her. For 2 years, I thought I'd been lucky. Now I was looking at my son's arm, and the luck had a rotten smell to it. That night, after Oliver fell asleep, I closed the bedroom door and turned on the lamp. I lifted his shirt carefully and photographed every bruise I could find. The yellowing ones, the fresh purple ones, the marks fading in strange stages of healing. 17 bruises in all. 17 points of evidence I had been too frightened, or too desperate, or too ashamed to see. My hands shook so badly, I had to retake some of the pictures. The next morning I called Dr. Reyes, his pediatrician, and asked for the first available appointment. I didn't tell the receptionist why. I was afraid if I said the words out loud, they would become real in a way I couldn't take back. Dr. Reyes examined Oliver behind a closed door while I sat outside in a plastic chair that seemed designed to make grown people feel like children. Every few minutes I heard the faint rustle of paper, the click of a pen. Finally, she came out. Her face was calm in the practiced way doctors use when they know a parent is already on the edge. But I saw the tension around her eyes. "The bruising pattern is concerning," she said carefully. "It's consistent with non-accidental injury." I stared at her. She continued, even more gently. "There are grab marks, impact marks with clear edges, and bruising in areas that are usually protected from ordinary childhood play. Some of these injuries would have required significant force. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. "How much force?" I asked finally. She held my gaze, enough to cause lasting pain. Something in me cracked then, not loudly, not all at once, but like ice giving way under too much weight. And with that crack came memories I had spent 30 years burying. My mother's hand across my face when I spilled milk as a child. The wooden spoon in the kitchen drawer. The way I learned to flinch before the blow landed, to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. The way I'd told myself it was discipline. Love with sharp edges. Normal. I'd spent my whole adult life pretending my childhood had been harsh but survivable, not violent. I had made peace with things that were never peace at all. And now I had handed my son to the same woman every Thursday. That realization nearly knocked me to the floor. That night I did something I had never imagined myself doing. I installed a recording app on Oliver's tablet. I told him it was a new learning game. He believed me. He always believed adults. The following Thursday, I packed his little backpack, kissed his forehead, and watched him walk into my mother's house, with a stomach full of dread so heavy it felt physical. At 6 in the evening, I picked him up like I always did. My mother stood in the doorway in her cardigan and soft slippers, smiling that polished smile she used on neighbors and church ladies, and anyone who might ever need to admire her. "Oliver was a perfect angel today," she said. He hung back by the wall, his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. There was a fresh bruise on the back of his shoulder blade, hidden under his shirt unless I knew to look for it. That night I waited until he was asleep, then put on headphones and listened. The first hour was almost unbearable in its ordinariness. The television murmuring in the background, Oliver asking for juice, the scrape of a chair, a lunch plate set down on a table. If I hadn't already known something was wrong, I could have mistaken it for any grandmother's house in any ordinary suburb. Then I heard my son ask for a second juice box. "You already had one," my mother said. Her voice changed instantly, flat, cold, sharp enough to cut glass. Greedy children get corrected. Oliver's small voice wavered. "I'm really thirsty, Grandma." The sound that followed was unmistakable. A slap, then Oliver crying, and my mother, with chilling calm, "You want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about." I sat there in the dark, headphones pressed so hard against my ears they hurt, while she told my 6-year-old son that his mother worked too hard to have him act selfish, that if he kept crying she would make sure I lost everything, that he would be the reason we ended up under a bridge. Over and over, she used me as the threat. Over and over, she made him carry the weight of my life like a weapon pointed at his own heart. By the time the recording ended, I was shaking so hard I had to set the tablet down before I dropped it. The next morning I called Detective Melton. He asked me to bring Oliver in, but before we left the apartment, I took one more set of photographs, then another, then I made copies. I was terrified of losing anything, terrified of some administrative failure or some disbelief or some petty human hesitation taking this out of my hands and sending Oliver back into that house. Dr. Reyes didn't hesitate when she saw him again. After the exam, she used words like consistent with abuse and pattern of inflicted injury and non-accidental trauma. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't soften the truth either. Something about hearing a professional say it out loud made the world rearrange itself. This wasn't me being paranoid. This wasn't me overreacting. This wasn't old family dysfunction dressed up as discipline. This was abuse. And then, because the human mind is cruel and efficient, the memories kept coming. I remembered being 7 and learning to keep my face still no matter what happened. I remembered my own mother telling me tears were manipulation. I remembered her saying I was dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive. I remembered the shame that settled into my bones so early it felt inherited. I had thought I escaped it. I hadn't escaped anything. I had simply learned how to function inside the damage, and now my son was the one paying for it. That Thursday I sent Oliver with the tablet again. I told him it was for learning. He looked nervous, but not enough to say no. He trusted me to protect him. That trust felt like both a gift and an accusation. When I picked him up that evening, my mother offered me coffee, complained about her hip, and kissed Oliver's forehead with theatrical affection. He turned his shoulders slightly away from her hand, almost without thinking. That tiny movement made me want to vomit. At home I listened again. This time the recording was worse because it was more specific. Oliver asked for a second juice box. My mother said no. He asked again. Then came the slap, followed by a burst of crying. "You want to be greedy?" she snapped. "Your mother works herself to death so you can have nice things, and this is how you repay her?" Another hit. "Stop crying now," she said, "or I'll give you something real to cry about." Then, quieter and more venomous, "If you tell her, she'll lose her job. You'll make her homeless. You want that on your conscience?" The way she said it, you'd think she was protecting me. That was the sickest part. She didn't just hurt him. She recruited him into the hurt. She turned fear into loyalty, guilt into silence. By the time the recording ended, I had already made my decision. I drove to her house at midnight. She opened the door in her robe, startled only for a second, before that old mask slid into place. Concern, innocence, maternal warmth in a face that knew exactly how to mimic it. "Is Oliver all right?" she asked. I held up my phone and pressed play. Her own voice filled the entryway. "Greedy children get corrected. I'll give you something to cry about. You want your mother to lose everything?" The color drained from her face, then came back in a furious wash of red. "You recorded me?" she demanded. "In your own house," I said. Her eyes went flat. "That's illegal. You hit my son. I disciplined him. You threatened him. I did what I had to do." She took a step closer, and I realized with a cold shock that she didn't look ashamed. She looked offended. "I did what I had to do." She took a step closer, and I realized with a cold shock that she didn't look ashamed. She looked offended. "I disciplined him the same way I disciplined you, and you turned out fine." I laughed once, a dry, broken sound. I hadn't turned out fine. I turned out terrified of my own memories. I turned out with a reflexive need to excuse cruelty. I turned out so used to pain that I had mistaken survival for health. I turned out willing to send my child into the hands of the woman who had taught me to accept harm as normal. "I will never let you touch him again," I said. She smiled then, small and cruel. "You need me. You'll be back Thursday." "Not this Thursday. Not ever." She looked at me with something close to contempt. "Then you'll lose your job. You'll lose your apartment. And when you come crawling back, I'll remind you of this moment." I left before I said something I couldn't take back. But I was too late to stop her from moving first. The next morning, before I had even finished getting Oliver ready for school, there was pounding at my door. 2 police officers, a CPS worker, and behind them, my mother, holding a tissue to her eyes as though she'd been crying for hours. "I'm so worried about my grandson," she said to them in a voice full of trembling concern. "His mother has been under a lot of stress. I've noticed bruises on him for months. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to protect him." She looked directly at me and gave the tiniest, most satisfying smile. I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. The older officer asked me to step aside. My mother had reported that I'd been physically abusing Oliver for months and had lost control under the strain of single parenthood. She claimed I was unstable, overworked, and dangerous. I could barely hear him over the pounding in my ears. Then the CPS worker introduced herself as Kara Thornton. She had a calm face, kind eyes, and the kind of careful professionalism that made me even more afraid because I had no idea whether she believed my mother's performance. She asked to speak to Oliver privately. He stood in the hallway clutching his backpack strap with both hands, looking from me to the strangers and then to my mother, whose face had transformed instantly into worried grandmother anguish. My son moved as if every step might trigger something. I hated that my child already knew how to move like a frightened animal. Before Kara took him into the bedroom, I pulled my phone out and showed her the photos. 17 images, dated, clear. Each bruise documented as carefully as I knew how. She looked through them in silence. Her expression changed only slightly, but I caught it. The tightening around her mouth, the quick, sharp inhale, the shift from neutral to alert, Then she took the phone and followed Oliver into the room. The officers asked me to sit at the kitchen table. My mother stayed in the living room, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear how deeply concerned she was, how she had tried to help, how difficult single mothers could be when overwhelmed, how brave she'd been to make the call. I listened in disbelief while one of the officers asked me when the bruises first appeared. I told him about Thursdays, about the pattern, about the tablet recording. He called for Detective Melton. My mother heard the name and immediately changed tone. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "I need to go home. I've done my duty here." Nobody let her leave. When the recording played over my phone speaker, the kitchen seemed to contract around us. The first slap alone altered the atmosphere. It was the sound of a line being crossed on purpose. The officer across from me stopped writing. His hand tightened on the pen. By the time my mother's threats about homelessness filled the room, her performance in the living room had started to fray. Detective Melton arrived faster than I expected, tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of composure that suggested he'd seen too much, and still somehow managed to remain human. He listened to the entire recording with headphones on, while standing in my kitchen, his eyes fixed on my mother like he was measuring how much of her mask was left. When he removed the headphones, he asked her plainly whether the voice on the recording was hers. She stared back. Technology can fake anything. He asked why Oliver's bruises matched the Thursdays he spent in her care. She said I must have inflicted them myself, and blamed her to avoid consequences. Kara came back out of Oliver's room with my phone, and a look on her face that made my chest tighten. She had found fresh bruising on his shoulder blade, less than a day old, in the exact shape of an adult grip. Oliver stood behind her, pale and frightened, his eyes huge in his small face. He looked at me like he wanted permission to exist in the room. I nodded to him, and I thought I might break in half from how much I wanted to protect that child. The rest moved quickly after that, and yet felt endless. Detective Melton asked my mother to come with him privately into my bedroom. Her voice rose through the closed door, sharp and offended and increasingly desperate. She accused me of poisoning Oliver against her. She said I was making him lie. She said she'd only ever disciplined him the way any good grandmother would. The officer beside me shifted uncomfortably. Oliver climbed into my lap without a word. He was trembling so hard I could feel it in his shoulders, in his knees, in the dampness of his breath against my neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over. "I'm sorry, Mommy." I held him tighter than I thought possible. "You did nothing wrong," I told him. "Nothing. Telling the truth is never wrong." Kara called in her supervisor. Bernadette Thornton arrived in a gray suit with an expression like tempered steel. She reviewed the photos, the medical notes, the recording, and then told me Oliver would need a forensic medical exam immediately. My mother tried to insist on coming to the hospital. Bernadette shut that down so fast it was almost elegant. By then, Detective Melton had given her the choice between coming voluntarily to the station or being arrested on the spot. She chose not to speak, which, in my mother's world, counted as strategy. At the hospital, a forensic nurse documented every bruise with a camera, a ruler, and a voice recorder. She was gentle with Oliver in a way that made me ache. Dr. Reyes added her own notes and photographs to the file, explaining that the pattern was one of the clearest cases of inflicted injury she had seen in years. Then came the interview. Oliver sat in a room with two little dolls while Kara asked questions softly and patiently. From the observation window, I watched my son point to the doll's arm and say, "Grandma grabbed him there when he asked for juice." He showed how she hit him with her hand when he laughed too loud. He demonstrated the wooden spoon. He mentioned the hairbrush. Each word felt like grief and relief at the same time. Grief because no child should have to explain violence in the language of toys. Relief because he was finally telling the truth to someone who believed him. By the time it was done, he was exhausted. He fell asleep against my shoulder in the waiting room, his body limp with the kind of tired that comes only after fear has burned itself out. Kara told me we could take him home, but CPS would do a follow-up visit the next day. At home, I laid him down carefully and sat beside him watching his breathing even out. My phone had 17 missed calls from my mother. I blocked the number. That night the apartment felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself had been changed. Oliver woke me several times, panicked and crying, asking whether Grandma knew where we lived, whether she could get in, whether she'd take him away. Each time I locked the door again, turned on the nightlight, and repeated the same promise. She cannot get in here. She cannot hurt you. You are safe. He believed me a little more each time. The protective order hearing came 3 days later. My mother arrived with a lawyer in an expensive suit, and the same tired, martyr-like expression she'd worn at my door. The judge granted the emergency protective order after reviewing the photos, the recording, the medical records, and the forensic interview. 6 months of no contact, no calls, no messages, no approaching our home, my work, or Oliver's school. My mother lunged verbally at the ruling, screaming that I would regret this, that I was destroying the family, that no court could keep a grandmother from her grandson forever. The judge had the bailiff escort her out. Oliver watched it all with his hand locked in mine so tightly it ached. When she turned at the door and looked at him, her face softened into something that almost resembled sorrow. That was the scariest expression of all. Because sorrow, from her, had always been a costume. A few days after that, Oliver met Chelsea Perkins, a child therapist with warm eyes and a calm voice. She introduced herself to him like he mattered, like he wasn't just a case file or a problem to manage. He took to her slowly, the way frightened children do. But when she gave him a stuffed bear to keep, I saw his shoulders drop half an inch, like his body had stopped bracing for impact. She told me he needed time, that he was hypervigilant, that he was constantly reading adult moods, trying to please everyone, always waiting for the next emotional storm. Those things were trauma responses, not personality flaws. Trauma could heal, she said, but only in a place where safety stayed consistent long enough for the nervous system to believe it. That sentence stayed with me, because neither Oliver nor I had ever had the luxury of believing safety would last. My own therapy started almost immediately after. Dr. Raymond listened as I stumbled through the story, the bruises, the recording, the confrontation, the police at my door. Then she asked about my childhood, and suddenly I was 6 and 8 and 12 again, standing in a house that smelled like furniture polish and anger. I remembered my mother's hand, the wooden spoon, the smallness I learned to wear like armor. I told Dr. Raymond that I had thought it was normal. She nodded and said, "Children often normalize abuse because it's the only way they can survive it." That sentence landed harder than I expected. She said I'd repeated the cycle not because I wanted to hurt Oliver, but because I had been conditioned to doubt my own instincts. My mother had taught me to distrust my pain for so long that by the time it appeared on my son's body, I needed overwhelming evidence before I could name it. And when I finally had the evidence, I acted. That mattered. I believed her, even if only a little at first. Oliver's therapy sessions became a kind of rhythm in our lives. Some weeks he drew pictures of monsters with angry eyes and huge hands. Some weeks he drew shields and houses and suns and small smiling stick figures standing under umbrellas. One day he drew a child holding a shield between himself and a dark shape labeled Scary Grandma. Chelsea told me that was progress. It meant he understood, even in a child's way, that the danger was outside him, not inside him. There was still a long road ahead, nightmares, flinching, the instinct to please adults no matter what. But the healing was happening. Slowly, really, and then the criminal case began. The first trial date came on a cold December morning. The courthouse smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the air inside seemed overworked, stale with too many stories of people trying to defend the indefensible. My mother wore a navy dress and the expression of a woman who believed appearing respectable could erase damage. It didn't. I took the stand first. My hands trembled as I described the pattern of bruises, the fear in Oliver's eyes, the recording, and the terrible realization that the woman who had raised me was now doing the same thing to my child. I had not planned to speak about my own childhood, but once the words started, they came like a flood. The wooden spoon, the slap for spilled milk, the way I learned to disappear. The defense attorney tried to frame all of it as outdated discipline, generational misunderstanding, family conflict blown out of proportion by a stressed single mother. I looked straight at the jury and said, "Bruises are not a generation gap. Oliver testified by closed-circuit television. He sat in a chair that made him look heartbreakingly small, but he answered clearly. He described the hand hits, the spoon, the threats about homelessness, how Grandma told him to say he didn't remember if anybody asked about bruises. My throat nearly closed watching him. The pediatrician testified. The forensic nurse testified. The recordings were played in full. The courtroom sat in absolute silence while my mother's voice filled the room with cruelty so ordinary it became monstrous. Greedy children get corrected. I'll give you something to cry about. You'll make your mother lose everything. The jury watched the evidence stack up from every direction. Photos, medical records, therapist notes, forensic documentation, the child's account, the recording of the abuse itself. By the time the defense tried to sell the idea that children just bruise easily, the argument had collapsed under the weight of reality. Closing arguments came and went. The jury deliberated. We waited in a coffee shop across the street, but I couldn't taste anything. My phone buzzed with messages from Madison, Carly, Chelsea, and my aunts, all of them checking in, all of them wanting to know what they could do. The kindness of those messages felt almost unreal compared to the life I'd been living only months earlier. At 4:30, the call came. We rushed back. The verdict was guilty on all charges. Child abuse, filing a false police report, guilty. The word echoed through me in strange, delayed waves. It took a moment for it to feel real. My mother sat perfectly still at the defense table, her face empty, almost blank. No apology, no remorse, nothing. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, under a gray December sky. The judge handed down 18 months in jail, followed by probation, mandatory anger management, mandatory parenting classes, and a permanent restraining order. No contact with Oliver, no contact with me, not directly, not through others, not ever. My mother's face went red, and for the first time she looked less like a grandmother and more like exactly what she was, a woman furious that consequences had finally found her. When she turned to look at me, there was such naked hatred in her eyes that a younger version of me might have folded under it. But I didn't. I held her stare until she was led away, and then, for the first time in years, I felt something in my chest unclench. Life after that didn't become easy all at once. It became manageable. Which, for us, was miraculous. Work gave me a promotion a few months later, along with better hours and a raise that finally made childcare possible. Carly and her daughter Madison became part of our routine, first with Thursdays, and then with more days as needed. Madison was patient, goofy, and warm in a way Oliver trusted almost immediately. She built blanket forts, made cookies, and played board games with him like his happiness was the point of the whole afternoon. Chelsea told me Oliver was making real progress. The nightmares faded. He stopped asking whether Grandma could get in the door. He started asking normal kid questions again. Why is the sky blue? Do fish sleep? Can dinosaurs really roar that loud? Those questions, which once would have sounded ordinary, felt sacred. My own therapy got harder before it got easier. There were sessions where I cried so long I left with swollen eyes and a headache, convinced I should have seen more, sooner. Raymond kept bringing me back to the same truth. I had broken the cycle the moment I recognized it. It wasn't too late, because Oliver was safe now. It wasn't too late, because the pattern had stopped with me. That phrase became something I held on to. It stopped with me. When Oliver turned 7, we threw him a birthday party in our apartment. The place was crowded and noisy and full of people who loved him. School friends, Madison, Carly and her family, my supportive aunts, and a mountain of pizza boxes and decorations from the dollar store. He wanted a superhero theme, so the walls were covered in masks and capes and bright colors that seemed almost absurdly cheerful after the year we'd had. He opened gifts with a grin so wide it changed his whole face. When it came time to blow out the candles, he shut his eyes tight and made a wish before exhaling in one smooth breath. Later, Madison told me what he'd wished for. Every day to be this happy, he'd said. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I didn't trust my own voice. A month after that, a letter arrived from the jail. It was from my mother. She wrote that she'd had time to think, that she'd realized she'd made mistakes, that she'd been raised the same way and hadn't known better, that she was taking classes, speaking to a counselor, learning to control her anger. She asked for forgiveness. She asked for a chance. I read every line twice. What struck me most was not that she was sorry, but how carefully she was still trying to explain herself. I didn't answer. I tore the letter into pieces and threw it away. I no longer needed her version of events to survive mine. Winter passed quietly after that. Oliver slept through the night more often than not. He went to school without stomach aches. His teacher sent home notes about how well he was doing, how kindly he played with the other kids, how eager he was to learn. Madison watched him more often now, and he adored her. My aunt stopped by with groceries and hugs and the kind of steady love that asks nothing in return. One afternoon in late February, my supervisor called me into her office and offered me a promotion, better pay, better hours, more responsibility. It was the kind of chance I would have once immediately talked myself out of, but this time I heard myself say yes before fear could get a vote. When I told Carly, she laughed and said I'd learned to advocate for myself everywhere now. She was right. Something in me had changed, not healed completely, not magically, but shifted. I no longer mistook silence for peace. I no longer confused endurance with love. I no longer believed that because someone raised me, they owned me, my child, or our lives. The last Thursday I remember before spring really began. I picked Oliver up from Madison's house and found him waiting on the porch with a drawing clutched in both hands. He came running when he saw my car. The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, one tall and one small, both smiling huge circles of happiness. Above them, in his uneven 7-year-old handwriting, he had written two words that hit me harder than any court ruling ever had: safe and happy. I knelt on the sidewalk and stared at it until the letters blurred. Then I pulled him into my arms and kissed the top of his head. "It's beautiful," I told him. He tucked himself against my side and asked if I liked it. "I love it," I said. "I'm putting it on the refrigerator where I can see it every day." That night, after dinner and bath time, I tucked him into bed and pulled the blanket to his chin the way he liked. He looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that had seen too much, and yet still held wonder in them. "I love you, Mommy," he said. "You're the best mom in the world." I kissed his forehead and felt the truth of what had taken me so long to learn. Protecting him had been the most important thing I'd ever done. Not because it saved him from bruises, because it taught both of us that love does not have to hurt to be real. I left his door cracked open and the hallway light on. As I turned away, I heard him humming softly to himself, a small content sound drifting into the apartment like a promise. And for the first time in my life, I believed that promise could last.